Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and peace be upon you. You're welcome to the Sharia Intelligence course. I am your host, Muhammad Nurudeen Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topic are two of our great brothers and students of knowledge like myself, Brother Ibrahim Bello and Brother Nasir Bello. You're both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Inshallah, today we will be looking at the first of the secondary sources. Last we discussed the primary sources of Quran and Hadith, and today we are starting with the first, or what is usually put as the first secondary source, which is Ijma. Ijma is usually described as consensus. But what I'd like to start asking our guests, starting with Malam Ibrahim Bello, is what exactly is consensus? What exactly is Ijma? Why is it important as a source of evidence in lawmaking, and what is the evidence for justifying it as a source of law?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. We begin in the name of God, praise be to God. Ijma is considered to be the next source of evidence after Quran and Sunnah, in that it means that scholars of the Ummah, of the Mujtahidun, are unanimous regarding a particular issue. Of course, if that is obtainable and it happens, it should be next to Quran. But what we find is it is just difficult to have scholars at the same time to endorse an issue world round. However, sometimes it is possible that there are issues that are undisputable, because you can't get people all the time to endorse. So some scholars define Ijma to mean the consensus of scholars of a particular time over a particular issue. In that case, it is much more like ijtihad. Okay? Ijtihad in a way. And if it is ijtihad in a way, then the limitations are it is likely contextual. It cannot be binding over the whole world. Or maybe at a time, but it may not be necessarily valid as the hukum and some rulings established by Quran and Sunnah, because as we know with ijtihad that are tied to context, over time when the context change, they need to review. Some look at it as when you have majority of scholars endorsing a position, while some will look at it, no, Ijma just means whatever Quran and Sunnah is clear about it and every scholar agree, you call this one Ijma. So a number of, you can see there is a little problem with like what exactly is Ijma. But of course, if it's truly obtainable that you can get the scholars to endorse the position, then that's perfect. Some look at it that Ijma, because when you have majority of scholars, meaning people who matter in that area, actually endorsing a position. Of course, like the Prophet ﷺ will say in a hadith, my ummah will not have consensus over what is not right. So these are some of the meaning and the possibilities, of course, with some limitations with what Ijma is. Simply put, consensus of scholars, okay, over an issue. But that consensus needs to have qualifier. It needs to be given a context, because in reality it's just difficult or impossible after the generation of the Sahaba to say you have Ijma. And unlike the Quran and Sunnah, okay, sometimes because some people are silent over a point, doesn't mean they accept it. Because some will go say, okay, you have a consensus which is not challenged. Yeah, it's not challenged doesn't mean it's also acceptable. So these are some of the possible meanings and the limitations of Ijma. But of course, it's a valid tool accepted by nearly all schools, and majority of scholars have used it in the past.
Okay. So what I get from what you've said is, firstly, ijma means consensus of jurists or scholars, but in some details you have diversity of opinions. What would you add to shed more light on this, please?
Well, what seems so obvious from the submission earlier made is the fact that the concept of ijma is indeed complex and loaded. In fact, that is why some scholars have even argued that there is no any consensus over the definition of ijma itself. Now, if you look at the definition given by Muhammad Hashim Kamali, for example, where he talked about the unanimous agreement of the Muslim Ummah after the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam on every other, on any issue, or sometimes he will say on issues of the religion. Now, himself underlines some critical words in the definition where scholars disagree over. One is this issue of unanimous, where he talked about the Maliki school insisting that ijma for them is the ijma of is the amal of al-Madinah, and other schools coming up with different interpretation of the unanimity of what exactly, what category of people. Is it the entire Shafi'i school, for example? They will talk about the the agreement of the entire ummah, and so it's difficult to come up with a unique definition. Obviously, the definition of ijma cannot be the opinion of the majority, because sometimes the strength of the argument and its validity and authority does not lie in the number of people that are behind the arguments. If you look at but again, some of the things that this definition highlights that seems interesting is where he talked about after the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Usually ijma, or the question of ijma, will only emerge or emanate when there is no any basis or authority from the Quran and Sunnah. Then ijma tend to be the next line of authority in trying to come up with position, or in trying to do ijtihad, or refer to as a source that scholars look into. And therefore, one interesting thing there is the fact that it is a rationalistic tool. Ijma is a rationalistic tool. The fact that it is entirely a human endeavor, a human effort. Now, if you look at some of the reasons from the text that usually scholars used to present to back, to make a case for the authority of ijma, there is this verse in Surah An-Nisa where the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying, whoever split from the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam after guidance have already appeared to him, and followeth not the path of the pious believers, Allah will give him what he desires for, and he will be landed in the hellfire. وَمَنْ يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولَ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى وَنُصْلِهِ جَهَنَّمَ. And also the other verse that talks about أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولُو الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. You obey Allah, you obey the messenger, and you obey people in authority. These are some of the verses that scholars used to bring to establish the authority of ijma. And there are of course many ahadiths that they used to bring forward when talking about ijma. One of those is لَا تَتَّمِعُ أُمَّتِي عَلَى ضَلَالَةٍ, that my ummah will not be united on something that is actually misleading or something that is wrong. And also there is this hadith of alaykum bil jama'ah fa inna yadullahi ma'al jama'ah. You should be with the group of people, with the congregation, that the hands of Allah is with the congregation. And another important hadith that they used to bring is this hadith that ma ra'ahu muslimina hasana fa inda Allahi hasana. Whatever Muslims or the pious believers see as good, then even in the eyes of Allah is also good. So these are some of the reasons that usually scholars used to bring to support or to establish the authority of ijma. Allahu ta'ala alam.
This is interesting because firstly, you have given what you call a theoretical definition of ijma, meaning consensus of jurists. And I think just like in any other field, once they say all gynecologists agree on something, then there must be some weight to that opinion. If all experts on a particular subject have a consensus. And I think it's also important the word ijma to not be confused with the word jamhur, majority. Majority has never been a source of law. What is a source of law when we talk in usulul fiqh? When we say ijma, we mean full consensus. But the other point you're also making is when we look at whose consensus, we find Malikis restricting it to the amal of Ahl al-Madina, or at least Mujtama Indana, certain agreements or certain segments within the amal Ahl al-Madina. The Shafis having their own definition, different groups having their own definition of what ijma actually is. Malam Ibrahim, you mentioned how for some ijma is claimed on issues the Quran and the Sunnah have already clarified. But you also mentioned how some look at ijma as a rationalistic tool, a product of ijtihad, just collective ijtihad, that ijtihad all coincides on a particular position, and that if we did have the Quran clear on an issue, we would not need to go to ijma, a secondary source. If we had the Sunnah and the Quran clear on an issue, we would not say ijma says, we would say Quran says, because Quran is a higher authority. However, the fact that the Quran and Sunnah are silent or ambiguous and we need to go to another source, it means scholars must have arrived at this conclusion that is not found in the Quran or the Sunnah through other means, other ways of ijtihad, which is why some scholars look at ijma as actually, or at least the ijma that is not claiming something that's already in the Quran and the Sunnah, they understand that ijma as actually a product of ijtihad. And definitely any consensus of all scholars would take weight. But again, as you've said, there is no consensus on the definition of ijma and scholars differ. Could we look at some common examples of ijma, or at least examples that are presented as good examples of ijma?
Okay. You would find some of the common examples that scholars present as ijma are like intentional laughter during prayer, that it actually spoils prayer, or the example of validity of actually contracting marriage with unspecified mahar. Or also you can find another interesting example is this allocation of 1/6 of mirath to grandmother. So these are some of the examples that you would find scholars actually having sort of an ijma on.
Thank you. Malam Ibrahim, would you add more to that?
Yeah, other examples will include that the guardianship of a grandfather. In the absence of father, it is a ijma, there is ijma that the grandfather automatically becomes the guardian. These are some of the examples.
So what we have therefore, and I think also probably another one that I've heard raised has been the prohibition of a Muslim woman marrying Kitabi, a Christian or a Jew, that there's an ijma on that. However, we find the term ijma very commonly used for so many topics, that there's a claim that there's ijma on this, ijma on that. What are some examples of ijma that are claimed by some, but which are not, and maybe popularly referred to as topics on which there's ijma, or topics on which there's consensus, but where in reality actually it's maybe just a majority opinion. So these are not really good examples of ijma in the view of some scholars. What are those examples, Malam Ibrahim?
Yeah, also you have a number of things that they are basically things that are established and known as the basics and fundamentals of religion, already established by Quran. You don't need ijma on them. You don't say that 5 compulsory prayers, that eating deliberately in Ramadan during the day breaks the fast is ijma, and all of those things. These are beyond ijma. These are like what you can call ma'lum min ad-din bi-darura. Like everybody knows them, nobody has issue with them. They are
because they are already established by the Quran and the Sunnah, higher authority.
Thank you. Some other times they will claim that the punishment for apostasy is ijma. It's not really ijma. Okay, hudud for homosexuality and a number of similar issues. They also say these things are ijma. They are not ijma. Okay, they are just issues that are already established by other, and some in fact no consensus on them. So they are not good examples of ijma in the real sense.
So you've brought some examples which I guess for many these are probably the first time they're hearing that the punishment of apostasy is not a topic on which there's ijma. You find Al-Baji, I guess, and a couple of other scholars disagreeing with others who may say it's a had, others say it's ta'zir. I think on homosexuality you mentioned the Hanafi school look at it as ta'zir, others look at it as had. Alam Ibrahim, would you add more examples to this?
Well, I think other examples that are claimed to be ijma or presented as ijma, but if you look carefully and critically, you would find other scholars actually having different opinion over these issues. For example, the issue of women leading men in prayer, or the issue of overall leadership of a woman, or for example, again, if you look at the case of a non-Muslim, a Muslim lady that actually Christian lady or a non-Muslim lady that converted to Islam, the question of the status of her marriage before accepting Islam, where the claim was actually that spoils the marriage, that actually invalidates the marriage. But you'll find many scholars coming up with, arguments that are actually contrary to that particular position. And another very good example is this issue of interfaith inheritance, where there is any possibility of inheritance outside will of people of different faith, maybe a child inheriting from his non-Muslim parents beyond the discussion around will, where you also find majority of opinion going on the way of prohibiting, but then you would find under certain circumstances some scholars trying to come up with a different opinion.
And I know also that scholars have actually gone out of their way to compile books of khilaf, books where they actually mention those topics and those scholars who have differed on some of these topics that many lay people may just assume there's already a consensus. Could you just a few references that you feel anybody interested in knowing whether there's diversity of opinion on a topic, are there some references any of you would share that may help for students of knowledge interested in learning more, books on khilaf?
What I remember immediately will be Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid by Ibn Rushd al-Hafid. Basically, what he did is to take the variety of views from all the mazahib on major chapters of jurisprudence and trying to justify where they are coming from. Okay? So he tell you that this is the issue. Maliki say this, Shafi'i say this, and he say وَسَبَبُ اِخْتِلَافُهُمْ, and he will begin to. It's a very good book that will give one some balance. And even if you are not agreeing, you appreciate. Of course, you have fiqhul makarana, like al-fiqhu ala mazahib al-arba'a, and a number of those kind of literatures.
Excellent.
And I think especially on this very issue of interfaith relations and issues around that, Ahkam al-Zimma of Ibn al-Qayyim has really a very interesting discussion around diverse opinions that are actually talking about these issues.
Excellent. And I think when it comes to English sources, it would be good. The book Bidayatul Mujtahid has actually been translated into English by a great Usuli scholar, Imran Khan Niazi. It's called The Distinguished Jurists Primer, and it's in 2 volumes. And there you find on nearly every topic those issues on which you have diversity among scholars, and very useful in creating the necessary intellectual humility to recognize where great scholars actually had certain disagreements on certain topics. The next question I'd like to start with Nasir. Why, just to wrap up on this subject, why have there been differences of opinion among jurists and schools of law regarding ijma? I know we've touched on some, but what more could you say?
Well, of course, some of the fundamental areas of differences of opinion are around the definition and the meaning associated with the concept of ijma. They look at the issue of quality. Is it all but, or the majority, or all but one? The question about timing, is it the scholars of a particular generation? You would find Imam Shafi'i come in with a definition of the entire ummah, the ijma of the entire ummah, while you find the Zahiri mazhab and the Hanbali insisting that ijma is the ijma of the companions. Imam Malik will talk about ijma as amal ahl al-Madina, as we discussed earlier. And you'd find even scholars within different schools coming up with different positions, like Imam al-Juwayni, if I have not mistaken, who talked about ijma of scholars of a particular generation. And you would find still other scholars talking about majority, the opinion of the majority as what is the definition of ijma. People like Imam al-Tabari and one of the Indo-Pakistani scholars, Shah Waliullah Dalawi, also have this particular position of being the opinion of the majority is what actually constitutes the meaning of ijma. And the second issue is actually around the textual evidence that is even presented as establishing the authority of ijma. A number of scholars have actually contested. They argued that it does not actually it does not actually clearly protect, it does not clearly explain and represent support or authority for ijma. They argued that it is subjective, and that is why in the discourse around ijma they are concerned about the many issues that there were claim of ijma over. They are concerned about the abuse of ijma, and of course they argued that most of the things that claim was made about ijma, actually they were opinions of the majority. In fact, according to some of them, ijma has become a tool of shutting conversation or discussion over issues of the deen. Also regarding these sources and basis for ijma, particularly the ones changing ijma, most scholars would argue that this is more of a collective ijtihad than an ijma. So ijma, if you look at it from the context of coming together of scholars, they must have relied on some basis, and usually these bases are some of the other tools of ijtihad, be it maslaha, be it, so it's sort of an expression of other tools of ijtihad by a number of scholars that is usually interpreted as ijma when you look at it carefully. And often opinion that are claimed to be very locally ijma usually is considered to be ijtihad, and you would find changing ijma, particularly when it comes to fatwa councils, as actually a replica or a manifestation of an ijtihad. These are some of the issues that most scholars have with the concept of ijma, basically.
Ibrahim, what would you add?
Yeah, other matters arising regarding this ijma include the fact that it is subjective. Of course, if it is obtainable, in reality it will be a very powerful tool. But they need to be cautious and try to see or try to have a sort of quick check using tools like istihsan, maslaha and saddu dhari'ah. If it can pass through these triangulation tests, I think it's fine. Not forgetting that aside primary sources, ijma, like other secondary sources, okay, are debatable. There is no unanimity about it. Also, sometimes you can look beyond triangulating it with these three tools, but sometimes you can actually look at it from maqasid perspective and qawaid perspective. Not forgetting that ijma, that is usually tied to context, very often can just not outlive the usefulness of its time, particularly in ever-changing world. And even at a point in time today, on many issues, it is very rare to have an ijma that will serve and be valid in every part of the world, depending on their reality. So the caution we are calling is, why Ijma is a very useful tool validated by scholars, and next to Quran and Sunnah, it has limitations and it should be applied with caution. Yes, sir.
I think this is a very important thing, the very big distinction between the theory of Ijma and the practical reality of Ijma. When you start asking for examples, when you talk about Ijma as just consensus of all jurists or all mujtahids, then nobody would argue about its strength in any field. If you say the greatest scholars all have a consensus, not a majority opinion, but a consensus, then definitely it would be very powerful. However, when you start asking for examples of that, where you start finding differing definitions, that's where you start getting the gap between the differing definitions of Ijma and the realities. And that's why what one scholar would say, this is an example of Ijma, another scholar would disagree and say, no, that's not an example. And really, it's just, this is an example of Ijma from one definition. I think one of the challenges some scholars raise is the fact that when people claim there's a consensus among all, not some, among all, when nobody went and gathered all, nobody went round to all to ensure there is actually a consensus. We don't have multiple chains of narrators telling us this is all. You just have one person telling you then there's an Ijma on this. It has unfortunately opened the door where some, as you've said, have just used Ijma as a sword to silence debate, to silence dissent. And the danger of that is that specialists in every field, mujtahids who will do new ijtihad on issues, every new ijtihad, just like new medicine, starts as a minority opinion. And even if it is correct, it would be wrong to silence it by a claim of Ijma that has actually not itself been verified or validated. And so this is, while therefore there is an agreement on the authority of Ijma, it seems to be an agreement on the theoretical definition of Ijma. However, in practice, I think we find Ijma, as good as the theoretical side is, the practical side, it has been very difficult to see its application and more difficult to see how it would be applied in contemporary realities. Most of what we have would probably be more majority opinions. But I think what is critical to remember from the points you have both raised is it is still not clear Quran and Sunnah. It is not what some would describe as qat'i thubut or qat'i dilala. It's not a source of truth that is certain beyond all reasonable doubt or beyond a shadow of doubt. It is still presumptive. It can be challenged by another Ijma. It can be challenged by another generation of scholars. And as you've mentioned, it is good when somebody presents an opinion that claims to be Ijma to dig further to find out, is this really an area of consensus based on what? I can imagine in northern Nigeria, for example, it would probably not be very difficult for scholars to reach an Ijma that it is unacceptable for a man to wear a wrapper or a sarong and be an imam, because in this culture that is women's dressing. However, that would be a very local Ijma, and that conclusion would not survive another environment that has a different culture. And so when Ijma is based on maslaha or based on urf or custom or some of these sources, it'll naturally change, as you said, as the context changes. I would like to end by just thanking you for all your contributions to the topic. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, inshallah, where we will look at the next tool of ijtihad among the secondary sources, qiyas. For now, we would just thank our discussants and resource persons, and thank you also. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.